I'll give you everything I have if you solve this, the businessman laughs, but the street kid surprises him. The golden lights of Chicago's most exclusive auditorium illuminated expectant faces. 500 guests dressed in formal attire occupied Italian leather seats, while television cameras focused on the main stage. There, with a smile that dripped arrogance, Jonathan Blake held a document that had made the country's most brilliant academics tremble. "I'll give you everything I have if anyone can solve this," he shouted, with a laugh that echoed throughout the hall. His Italian designer suit fit perfectly on his imposing figure. Gold cufflinks gleamed under the spotlights as he waved the paper with contempt. His grey eyes scanned the audience like a predator enjoying its prey. For weeks, he had turned his challenge of the century into a television spectacle where university experts, award-winning mathematicians, and recognized geniuses failed one after another against his impossible riddle. The document contained a lethal combination of cryptographic equations, logical sequences, and codes that seemed to defy all human reason. Jonathan had invested years and millions of dollars creating it, just to enjoy watching the brightest minds crash against his intellectual wall. "Come on, professors," he mocked, while academics sweated in front of the blackboards. "So much studying for this? My fortune is waiting for you." But no one saw what the cameras weren't focusing on. In the back of the auditorium, almost invisible among the shadows of the last row, a boy about 10 years old observed everything with enormous, curious eyes. His dirty clothes contrasted brutally with the luxury surrounding him. A box of homemade cookies rested on his thin knees, and his small fingers clung to it as if it were his only possession in the world. The boy had arrived there by chance. He was selling cookies on the street when he saw the elegant crowd entering the building. A distracted guard, a partially open door, and his natural curiosity had led him to that moment. Jonathan, with his cruel radar always active, noticed the small figure in the shadows. His eyes lit up with a new idea for humiliation. "Do you want to try too?" he asked in a mocking tone, pointing at the boy. "Come here, I'll give you my fortune if you solve it." The auditorium erupted in nervous laughter. The cameramen turned their lenses toward the boy, who stood up slowly, without letting go of his box of cookies. No one could imagine that in the next few minutes, Jonathan's laughter would freeze on his face forever. If this story has already touched your heart, tell us what country you're watching from, leave your like to support more stories like this, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Now then, what happened next left everyone speechless. Jonathan Blake had built his financial empire on two pillars: ruthless intelligence and an ego that knew no limits. At 48 years old, he controlled banks, real estate companies, and tech firms on 3 continents. His offices occupied the highest floors of the most exclusive skyscrapers, and his name appeared on lists of the world's richest men. But wealth had rotted something essential inside him. Having more money than entire countries was no longer enough. He needed to prove that he was also more intelligent than any mortal. Thus was born his obsession, creating the perfect enigma, the problem that no human mind could solve. For 3 years, he had recruited cryptographers, quantum mathematicians, and pure logic specialists. Together, they had built a mental labyrinth that combined number theory, fractal patterns, ancient codes, and sequences that seemed to defy the laws of rational thought. The challenge of the century had become his personal spectacle. Each month, he summoned the brightest minds on the planet. He made them travel from elite universities, paid them millionaire salaries to participate, and then publicly humiliated them when they failed. "Education is overrated," he used to tell reporters. "I never needed degrees to be rich, just natural intelligence." That night, the auditorium had been prepared like a modern coliseum. Giant screens displayed the riddle's equations, while 5 world-renowned academics faced the challenge. Each had 2 hours to find the solution. The first was Dr. Arthur Langley, Professor Emeritus of Applied Mathematics at Harvard. His hands trembled when he saw the first lines of the document. For 90 minutes, he filled 3 blackboards with complex calculations, but finally gave up with tears in his eyes. "It's impossible," he murmured. "This doesn't follow any known logic." Jonathan applauded slowly, his smile growing like that of a shark smelling blood. "Next," he said with theatrical cruelty. Dr. Emily Carter, a cryptography specialist from MIT, lasted barely an hour before admitting defeat. Her quantum calculations crashed against a wall of mathematical paradoxes that seemed to laugh at centuries of human knowledge. One by one, the geniuses fell. The auditorium filled with almost palpable tension. The guests began to murmur among themselves. The cameras captured every gesture of frustration, every moment of intellectual defeat, but Jonathan hadn't noticed the small, silent observer in the last row. Matthew had entered the building following a group of cameramen. His day had begun as always, waking up on a bench in the central square, washing his face in the public fountain, and preparing his box of homemade cookies to sell on the busiest corners. At 10 years old, Matthew knew the streets like a mental map. He knew where to find food, where to sleep without being bothered, and how to become invisible when authorities conducted raids. Orphaned since age 6, he had learned that survival depended on 3 things: observing everything, trusting few, and never calling attention to himself. But there was something different about Matthew. While other street children took refuge in fantasy or despair, he found comfort in numbers and patterns. With pieces of charcoal, he drew equations on walls. With small stones, he created mathematical sequences on the ground. The discarded books he found in the trash became treasures more valuable than any coin. Now, sitting in that leather seat worth more than everything he had ever owned in his life, Matthew observed the equations on the giant screens with fascination that grew by the minute. Jonathan finished humiliating the 5th academic and strolled across the stage like a Roman emperor in the Colosseum. His gaze scanned the audience looking for his next victim when he stopped at the small figure in the back. "Well, well," he said into the microphone, "it seems we have a special guest." The spotlights turned toward Matthew, who blinked from the sudden brightness. His patched clothes, his broken shoes, his thin but dignified face created a brutal contrast with the luxury surrounding him. "Do you want to try too, little one?" asked Jonathan with a cruel smile. "Come here. I'll give you my fortune if you solve it." The auditorium erupted in laughter, mixed with discomfort. Some guests began to feel uncomfortable about the cruelty of the spectacle. Matthew stood up slowly. His legs trembled slightly, but his gaze remained firm. He walked down the central aisle, while 500 pairs of eyes followed him. Each step echoed in the tense silence of the auditorium. When he reached the stage, Jonathan handed him the document with theatrical flourish. "There you have it, champ. 2 hours, just like everyone else." Matthew took the paper with his small hands. He looked at it for a few seconds that seemed eternal. Then, something extraordinary began to happen. What no one expected was that this invisible child, this small cookie seller who had learned mathematics in the garbage, was about to demonstrate that true intelligence isn't bought with money or taught in elite universities. It develops in the streets, is forged in survival, and flourishes in minds that have learned to see patterns where others only see chaos. Matthew's story had begun in a small room in a poor neighborhood where his mother, Helen, worked 12 hours daily as a cleaning lady to support her son. Helen had become pregnant at 19 by a man who disappeared as soon as he learned the news. She never told Matthew his father's name, only that he was someone important who didn't know how to value what he had. When Matthew turned 6, Helen became ill with pneumonia that was complicated by years of exhausting work and poor nutrition. On her deathbed, she whispered to him the only words he would remember forever. "You're smarter than all of them, my love. Never forget that." Uddud, the state placed Matthew in an overcrowded orphanage where 30 children shared dormitories designed for 10. The caregivers, overwhelmed and underpaid, could barely guarantee 1 meal a day. Matthew quickly learned that the weakest didn't survive, but he also discovered that the smartest could find alternatives. At 8 years old, he escaped from the orphanage. Life on the streets was brutal, but at least it was his own. He slept in bus stations, under bridges, in abandoned markets. He learned to recognize the sounds of the city, when police raids were coming, when merchants threw away food that was still edible, when it was safe to sleep. But what really saved Matthew was his insatiable hunger for knowledge. In university dumpsters, he found discarded books, loose pages from mathematics treatises, fragments of physics books, logic problems written by hand by students. With each piece of paper, Matthew built his own fragmented but deep education. He learned to read with advertising signs and old newspapers. Numbers became his best friends because, unlike people, they always followed clear and fair rules. 2 plus 2 was always 4, regardless of whether you had money or lived on the street. On the walls of abandoned alleys, Matthew drew equations with found charcoal. He created patterns with small stones, arranging them according to sequences that only he understood. The merchants at the Central Market knew him as the weird kid who played with numbers, but some had noticed something special in him. Mrs. Martha Jenkins, a bakery owner, was the first to give him a real opportunity. She noticed that Matthew could calculate change faster than her old calculator and offered to help her with accounts in exchange for food. Soon, other merchants began asking for his help with their inventories and profits. "That boy has something different," Mrs. Jenkins told her neighbors. "He sees numbers where we see only problems." Over time, Matthew began making homemade cookies using recipes he calculated mathematically to maximize flavor with cheap ingredients. His small business gave him just enough to survive, but more importantly, it gave him dignity. He never begged. He never stole. He worked for every coin he earned, and although he lived in absolute poverty, he maintained an integrity that impressed those who knew him. The night of the challenge of the century, Matthew had been selling cookies on the street when he saw the elegant crowd entering the city's most luxurious auditorium. His natural curiosity, the same that had led him to study mathematics in the garbage, prompted him to investigate. A distracted security guard, a partially open service door, and his natural ability to become invisible allowed him to sneak into the back row of the auditorium. While the world's most prestigious academics crashed against Jonathan's riddle, Matthew observed the equations on the giant screens with growing fascination. His mind, trained to find patterns in the chaos of street life, began to detect something the experts couldn't see. Now, standing on the stage with the document in his hands, Matthew felt the gaze of 500 pairs of eyes fixed on him. Some looked with contempt, others with pity, many with morbid curiosity to see how the street kid would be humiliated. But Matthew didn't feel fear. He had faced worse things than the cruel looks of rich people. He had survived hunger, cold, loneliness, and abandonment. A mathematical problem, no matter how complex, couldn't be more challenging than finding food for breakfast every morning for 4 years. He sat on the stage floor, ignoring the elegant seats. He spread the document on the cold marble and began to study it with the same concentration he had used to decipher equations in broken books. What no one in that auditorium knew was that Matthew's mind had been forged by the purest necessity: survival. While the academics had learned theories in comfortable classrooms, he had learned to solve real problems with limited resources, and that difference was about to change everything. The silence in the auditorium became almost sacred. Matthew, sitting on the floor as if it were his natural place of study, examined the document with concentration that gradually captured everyone's attention. His eyes moved quickly from one line to another, and occasionally his lips moved as if he were maintaining a silent conversation with the numbers. Jonathan, initially amused by his own cruelty, began to feel a strange discomfort. He had expected the boy to feel intimidated, to ask for help, or simply give up after a few minutes. But Matthew seemed genuinely absorbed in the problem. The first 15 minutes passed in complete silence. The defeated academics approached the stage discreetly, initially out of morbid curiosity, but gradually because of something they couldn't explain. There was something in the boy's posture, in the way his fingers traced invisible lines over the paper, that suggested deep understanding. "Do you need paper to write?" asked Dr. Langley condescendingly, offering his notebook. Matthew looked up for the first time. His eyes, enormous and bright, showed a clarity that surprised the academic. "No," he said simply, "I just need to see." And he continued studying. At 30 minutes, something extraordinary began to happen. Matthew stood up and walked to one of the blackboards that the experts had filled with failed calculations. With confidence no one expected, he began erasing specific sections of the equations. "What are you doing?" shouted Jonathan, his patience running out. "You can't change other people's work." "I'm not changing it," Matthew replied, without turning around. "I'm correcting it." A murmur of disbelief ran through the auditorium. The boy began writing numbers and symbols with mathematical precision that left the academics speechless. These weren't the clumsy strokes of a child playing with concepts he didn't understand. They were the firm lines of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Dr. Carter moved closer to the blackboard, her eyes following every movement of the marker in Matthew's hands. Suddenly, her pupils dilated with understanding. "My God," she whispered, "he's using graph theory combined with fractal analysis, but that application, I've never seen anything like it." Matthew worked with fluidity that hypnotized. His small hands moved with surgical precision, connecting concepts that had remained separate in the experts' minds. Where they had seen impossible complexity, he saw an elegant pattern waiting to be revealed. At 45 minutes, he had filled 3 blackboards with a mathematical demonstration that combined elements from different branches of mathematics in ways no one had considered before. The solution took shape like a numerical symphony, where each element connected with the others in perfect harmony. Dr. Langley, initially skeptical, began verifying each line of Matthew's calculations. His face gradually paled. This is correct," he murmured, unable to believe his own words. The other academics approached as if drawn by a magnet. One by one, they verified different sections of the demonstration. Their expressions of disbelief transformed into amazement, then into pure admiration. "How is this possible?" asked Dr. Carter. "This child has solved in less than an hour what we couldn't in months of preparation." But Matthew hadn't finished. On the 4th blackboard, he began writing something that made Jonathan's heart stop completely. He had not only solved the riddle, he had found 3 different solutions to the same problem, each using a different mathematical method. And more shocking still, he had identified a fundamental error in the original construction of the problem, an error that had gone unnoticed by all the experts who had helped create it. The auditorium erupted in a murmur of excited voices. Journalists approached with cameras and microphones. Academics discussed animatedly among themselves, checking and rechecking each calculation. Jonathan remained motionless in the center of the stage, his face a mask of shock and confusion. For 3 years, he had used that riddle to humiliate the brightest minds on the planet, and now, a street child, a small cookie seller who had never set foot in a university, had solved it as if it were an elementary homework problem. Matthew turned toward him with a serene expression. "Is this okay?" he asked, with the genuine innocence of a child who had just completed a fun game. But before Jonathan could respond, something even more shocking happened. Matthew saw a familiar face among the crowd, one of the journalists who had been covering the event. It was the same man who had interviewed his mother years ago when she worked as a cleaning lady in one of the city's most important corporate towers. "Mr. Hayes," said Matthew, recognizing the journalist, "do you remember my mum, Helen Carter? You wrote about her when she was fired." The journalist approached, his eyes filling with understanding and horror. "Helen, yes, I remember. She worked in the offices of—" He stopped, looking directly at Jonathan. "She worked at Blake Financial." A deadly silence took over the auditorium. Jonathan felt as if the floor were opening beneath his feet. "My mum always said my dad was someone important," Matthew continued with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Someone who didn't know how to value what he had." Jonathan's eyes filled with tears as memories hit him like emotional tsunamis. Helen Carter, the administrative employee who had gotten pregnant, the woman he had fired without a second thought when he learned of her pregnancy, worried only about avoiding legal responsibilities. He never knew he had had a son. He never knew that son had been living on the streets while he built ivory towers. He never knew that the most intelligent child he had ever met in his life was his own blood. The irony was so cruel and perfect that it seemed designed by destiny itself. The man who had spent years humiliating experts with his impossible riddle had just been humiliated by the son he had unknowingly abandoned. And that son hadn't solved the problem to win money or fame. He had solved it because he truly enjoyed numbers, because he found beauty in patterns, because he had the kind of pure intelligence that can't be bought or taught. You can only be born with it, nurture it with love, and let it flourish with dignity. Jonathan collapsed into a chair, his entire world crumbling in seconds. The silence that followed the revelation was deafening. Jonathan Blake, the man who had controlled financial empires and humiliated geniuses, found himself face to face with a truth that destroyed every fiber of his being. The memories hit him with the force of an emotional hurricane. Helen Carter was 21 when she worked in the administrative department of Blake Financial. She was intelligent, hard-working, and had a smile that lit up the grey offices on the 42nd floor. Jonathan, then a 35-year-old executive obsessed with his career, had had a brief relationship with her during a period of personal loneliness. When Helen told him she was pregnant, Jonathan panicked. He was in the middle of crucial negotiations for a corporate merger. His marriage to a millionaire heiress was being arranged for social convenience, and a scandal could ruin everything he had built. He fired her that same week. He invented an excuse about department restructuring and gave her a generous severance package with the condition that she sign a confidentiality agreement. Helen, devastated but dignified, took the money and disappeared from his life. Jonathan never asked about the baby. He never took interest in knowing if it had been a boy or girl. He never thought about the consequences of his actions beyond his own convenience. For years, he had built emotional walls so high that he had completely forgotten there was a human being created by him, growing somewhere in the world. Now, seeing Matthew standing in front of him with those enormous, intelligent eyes, Jonathan saw a cruel reflection of his own childhood face. The same grey eyes, the same bone structure, the same mental intensity he had possessed before greed corrupted his soul. "Helen died when I was 6 years old," Matthew continued with the devastating honesty of a child who had never learned to lie. "She worked very hard. She was always tired. She said my dad was important, but that he hadn't known how to value us." Each word was a direct stab to Jonathan's heart. Helen had died young, probably from stress and the overload of raising a child alone. While he accumulated millions in bank accounts, his son's mother had died from exhaustion and abandonment. "Then I went to the orphanage," Matthew continued, oblivious to the emotional collapse he was causing. "But I escaped because I didn't like it. I've been living on the street since I was 8. I sell cookies and study mathematics with old books." The journalists had caught the connection. The cameras focused alternately on Jonathan, devastated and trembling, and on Matthew, serene and patiently waiting for an answer to his original mathematical question. Dr. Langley, still processing the mathematical genius he had just witnessed, spoke into the crushing silence. "This boy didn't just solve the riddle," he said with a trembling voice. "He has demonstrated an understanding of mathematics that surpasses most doctorates I know. His method is completely original." "Doctor," Carter added, "his way of seeing patterns, it's as if he thinks in a mathematical language that we barely know. This can't be taught. It's pure, natural genius." But for Jonathan, Matthew's mathematical capabilities were secondary compared to the overwhelming guilt that was consuming him. This brilliant child, this small human being who had survived years of abandonment and poverty, was his son, his blood, his abandoned responsibility. While the academics celebrated the discovery of a mathematical prodigy, Jonathan could only see the greatest moral failure of his life walking, breathing, and looking at him with innocent expectation. He slowly rose from his chair, his legs trembling like those of an old man. He walked toward Matthew, each step weighing more than the previous one. The entire auditorium watched in absolute silence. When he reached his son, Jonathan knelt down to be at the boy's eye level. Tears ran freely down his face, years of repressed emotions finally being released. "Matthew," he whispered with a broken voice, I am your dad." The boy looked at him with curiosity, without shock or drama. For years he had imagined what it would be like to meet his father. He had fantasized about heroic reunions, dramatic explanations, movie-like embraces. But reality was simpler and more complicated at the same time. "Why didn't you look for me?" Matthew asked with the directness that only children possess. The question was simple, but it contained years of loneliness, cold, hunger, and nights sleeping on park benches, wondering why he didn't have what other children took for granted: a family. Jonathan had no answer. There was no excuse that could justify a decade of abandonment. There was no explanation that could repair years of street survival. There were no words that could bring Helen back or give Matthew the childhood he deserved. "I don't know," was all he could say. "I don't know, and I'm sorrier than you could ever imagine." Matthew nodded slowly, processing information that would change his life forever. Then, with the practical wisdom that children who have had to take care of themselves develop, he asked the most important question: "So what are we going to do now?" That question, so simple and direct, was like a ray of clarity for Jonathan. For the first time in decades, he had the opportunity to do something genuinely important. Not build a business empire, not make more money, not impress anyone. He had the opportunity to be a father. Jonathan Blake's transformation wasn't instantaneous, but it was complete. In the days following the challenge of the century, the country's most arrogant man became someone unrecognizable to those who had known his previous cruelty. That same night, after the cameras turned off and the auditorium emptied, Jonathan took Matthew to his penthouse. The boy, accustomed to small and functional spaces, walked through the enormous rooms with silent curiosity. "Do you live alone here?" he asked, looking at the very high ceilings and windows that showed the entire illuminated city. "Yes," Jonathan replied, seeing his home through his son's eyes. "I've always lived alone." The irony wasn't lost on him. He had had all the space in the world, but had never had a family to fill it. That night, Matthew slept in a bed for the first time in 4 years. Jonathan stayed awake until dawn, sitting in a chair next to the bed, observing his son's peaceful face and promising himself that he would never abandon him again. The next morning, Jonathan did something no one expected. He called a press conference, but this time it wasn't to humiliate anyone, it was to publicly humiliate himself. "I have spent years preaching that intelligence is measured by financial success," he began, his voice trembling slightly. Yesterday, I discovered that the most intelligent human being I have ever known is my own son, who has lived on the streets for years while I built ivory towers. The journalist leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing something historic. Matthew didn't just solve my riddle. He taught me that I had solved the problem of my own life wrong. Therefore, effective immediately, I am transferring 80% of my personal fortune to the Matthew Carter Foundation, dedicated to identifying and supporting children with exceptional talent who have been abandoned by the system. The announcement caused an earthquake in financial media. His company's shareholders panicked. His advisors threatened him with lawsuits. But Jonathan had found something more valuable than money, a real purpose. Matthew, who had insisted on being present at the conference, approached the microphone with his box of cookies still in his hands. "I want other kids like me not to have to live on the street," he said, with the clarity of someone who had lived the reality he was describing. "And I want to keep studying mathematics, but I also want to help." The image of the child prodigy talking about helping others while still carrying the cookies he had sold to survive went viral in minutes. But for Jonathan, the most important thing was the word Matthew had used. "I want to keep studying." His son hadn't lost his intellectual curiosity despite years of pure survival. That hunger for knowledge, that passion for learning, had survived intact through poverty, abandonment, and loneliness. Jonathan hired the world's best tutors, but with one condition: they had to adapt to Matthew's learning style, not the other way around. The boy had developed unique methods for understanding complex concepts, and forcing him to follow traditional methods would be like asking a poet to write only with mathematical formulas. The Matthew Carter Foundation became more than a charitable organization. It was a social laboratory where hidden talents in marginalized populations were identified and supported. In 3 months, they had found a 12-year-old girl who composed complex symphonies using street sounds, a teenager who had developed revolutionary methods of urban agriculture, and other cases of genius flourishing in impossible circumstances. But the deepest change occurred in the relationship between father and son. Jonathan, accustomed to dominating conversations and imposing his will, had to learn to listen. Matthew, accustomed to total independence, had to learn to trust another person. The first months were difficult. Matthew would wake up early and go out to walk the streets, his body still programmed for urban survival. Jonathan, terrified of losing him again, followed him discreetly until the boy confronted him. "Why are you following me?" Matthew asked one morning, suddenly turning around in the middle of the central square. "I'm afraid you won't come back," admitted Jonathan, his vulnerability visible for the first time in decades. "I always come back," Matthew replied, "but I need to walk. It's like you need to work. It helps me think." It was then that Jonathan understood that being a father didn't mean possessing or controlling. It meant understanding, supporting, and being present without suffocating. They began walking together in the mornings. Jonathan, who had spent years seeing the city from skyscraper windows, rediscovered it through his son's eyes. Matthew showed him places where he had found books, corners where he had solved complex mathematical problems, benches where he had slept under the stars, calculating distances between constellations. "Were you never afraid?" asked Jonathan one morning as they passed an alley where Matthew had lived for months. "Yes," the boy replied, "but fear doesn't go away by running. It goes away by understanding." It was wisdom that no university had taught Jonathan. His son, at 10 years old, had developed a philosophy of life deeper than all the millionaire executives he knew. 6 months after their first meeting, Jonathan made the most important decision of his new life. During a quiet dinner at home, he placed a folder of legal documents on the table. "I want to officially adopt you," he told Matthew. "Not just as my financial heir, as my son in every sense." Matthew looked at the papers seriously, reading each line with the same concentration he had used to solve the mathematical riddle. "Does that mean I won't have to live alone anymore?" he asked. "It means you'll never have to live alone again," Jonathan replied, his voice loaded with promises he knew he could keep. "And I can keep helping other kids? You can do everything your heart and mind tell you is right." Matthew signed the papers with the same hand that had solved impossible equations. But for him, this wasn't a legal transaction. It was confirmation of something he had gradually begun to feel. For the first time in his life, he belonged somewhere. That night, while Matthew slept in his new room, which he had decorated with blackboards full of equations instead of sports posters, Jonathan reflected on the transformation he had experienced. A year ago, he had measured his success by the number of people he could humiliate. Now he measured it by the number of people he could help shine. A year ago, he had believed intelligence was demonstrated by defeating others. Now he knew it was demonstrated by elevating others. A year ago, he had lived at the top of the world, but completely alone. Now, he lived with purpose, surrounded by a chosen family and a mission that gave meaning to each day. The country's richest man had discovered that true wealth isn't counted in banks. It's counted in hearts touched, lives changed, and the quiet pride of watching your son become a better version of what you ever were. 2 years after the challenge of the century, Jonathan and Matthew's life had found a rhythm that neither had experienced before. The extraordinary normalcy of being a real family. Mornings began with quiet breakfasts, where Matthew explained new mathematical concepts he had discovered, and Jonathan shared business strategies he was applying at the foundation. It was an exchange between mentor and apprentice that flowed in both directions. Matthew had grown several inches and gained healthy weight, but more importantly, he had developed the confidence that comes from knowing someone will be there when you get home. His eyes remained enormous and intelligent, but now they shone with the security of an unconditionally loved child. The Matthew Carter Foundation had identified and supported more than 1,000 exceptional children in vulnerable situations. They had created comprehensive scholarships, mentorship programs, and most revolutionary, a method for detecting hidden genius in populations society had labeled as hopeless. Jonathan had discovered that directing the foundation required the same strategic skills as building a business empire, but with an infinitely more satisfying result. Instead of accumulating wealth, he was multiplying opportunities. One Wednesday afternoon, while reviewing applications for new scholarships, Matthew looked up from his laptop. "Dad," he said, the word that still made Jonathan's heart skip a beat every time he heard it. "Can I ask you something? Anything you want." "Do you ever regret having changed so much?" It was a profound question coming from a 12-year-old, but Matthew had always had the ability to go straight to the center of important issues. Jonathan left his documents and turned completely toward his son. "Do you know what's the only thing I regret?" he replied. "Not having changed earlier, having lost the first 10 years of your life. But if you had changed earlier, maybe you wouldn't have had the money to help so many kids now." Matthew's wisdom never ceased to amaze Jonathan. His son had developed a perspective on life that combined pragmatism with compassion, intelligence with humility. "Maybe," admitted Jonathan, "but I would rather have been your dad from the beginning, even if that meant helping fewer people." "I wouldn't," Matthew replied firmly. "Because then I wouldn't have met Mrs. Jenkins or Mr. Carlos from the market or learned mathematics on the street. All those experiences made me who I am." Jonathan approached and hugged his son, marveled by the emotional maturity he had developed through experiences that would have broken many adults. "Besides," Matthew continued with a mischievous smile, "if I hadn't lived on the street, I would never have learned to solve problems in ways that university professors don't teach." It was true. Matthew's unique method for approaching complex problems had become study material at several universities. Mathematics professors came from other countries to observe how a child who had learned with discarded books could find solutions that escaped academics with decades of formal experience. That night, during dinner, Matthew made an announcement that would change the next chapter of their lives. "I've been thinking about the Foundation's next project," he said, carefully cutting his food. "I want us to visit other countries. There are kids like me everywhere, but nobody's looking for them." "Who? Are you serious?" asked Jonathan. "Do you want to travel the world identifying hidden talents?" "Not just identify them, create foundation centers in different places, teach other people how to find geniuses on the streets, in orphanages, in places where nobody looks." The proposal was ambitious, but Jonathan had learned never to underestimate his son's ideas. Matthew had the unique ability to see possibilities where others saw only problems. "And your education? Your tutors say you could be ready for university in 2 years. "University will be there when I get back," Matthew replied, "but there are kids who won't survive if we wait." It was irrefutable logic, presented with the moral urgency that characterized Matthew when he spoke about helping others. 3 months later, Jonathan and Matthew began what they called the Hidden Talents Expedition. They visited orphanages in Asia, refugee camps in Africa, slums in Latin America, and indigenous communities in North America. In each place, Matthew had an almost supernatural ability to connect with children who had been ignored or underestimated. He spoke their language, not necessarily the language of words, but the language of survival, creativity born of necessity, and intelligence forged in adversity. In Bangkok, they found a 9-year-old girl who had created a complete water purification system using recycled materials. In Lagos, they discovered a teenager who composed mathematical music that fused traditional African rhythms with harmonic theories that didn't exist in Western books. In Guatemala, they met twins who had developed vertical farming methods that could feed entire communities in minimal spaces. Each discovery confirmed Matthew's central theory: human genius is distributed equally across all populations, but opportunities to develop it are not. A year after beginning their worldwide expedition, father and son returned home with plans to establish Matthew Carter Foundation Centers in 22 countries. They had identified more than 5,000 children with exceptional talents and had created an international network of mentors, educators, and benefactors committed to finding and nurturing hidden genius. During their first night back, while dining on the penthouse terrace that now truly felt like home, Matthew made an observation that encapsulated everything they had lived through together. "Do you know what I learned on this trip?" he asked, looking at the city lights that he had once wandered alone and aimlessly. "What?" "That family isn't just the people you share blood with. It's the people who choose to stay with you and help you become the best version of yourself." Jonathan felt tears in his eyes. His son had articulated something he had felt, but had never been able to express so clearly. "That means we now have a family of thousands of children around the world," Matthew added with a smile, "and all of them have the opportunity to shine because a very brave boy decided to solve a mathematical problem 3 years ago," Jonathan replied. "No," Matthew corrected. "They have that opportunity because a very brave dad decided to completely change his life when he discovered what really mattered." That night, Matthew fell asleep in his room filled with blackboards, with equations from around the world, maps marking locations of future foundation centers, and photos of all the extraordinary children they had met on their expedition. Jonathan stayed awake a little longer, reflecting on the miracle of transformation he had experienced. 3 years ago, he had been the most hated man in the country. Now he was the father of a genius, mentor to thousands of children, and director of an organization that was changing lives on 6 continents. But more important than all that, for the first time in his life, he knew with absolute certainty that he was doing something that mattered. The child who had solved his mathematical riddle had ended up solving the much more complex enigma of how to transform an empty life into an existence with purpose. And every night, when he heard Matthew's peaceful breathing in the adjoining room, Jonathan reminded himself that true wealth is measured in moments like those, knowing that someone extraordinary considers you family, and that together you are making the world a place where genius can flourish regardless of where it's born. 10 years after the day that changed everything, Dr. Matthew Carter Blake walked toward the podium of the world's largest convention center to receive the Nobel Prize in Mathematics, a category that had been created specifically to recognize mathematical applications that solved global humanitarian problems. At 22 years old, he had revolutionized not only applied mathematics, but the way the world identified and nurtured exceptional human talent. His theory of distributive genius had scientifically proven what he had intuited as a child. Extraordinary intelligence exists in equal proportion in all human populations, regardless of their socio-economic situation. The Matthew Carter Foundation, now present in 86 countries, had identified and supported more than 50,000 children with exceptional talents. Many of them had grown up to become innovators, scientists, artists, and leaders who were solving some of humanity's most complex problems. In the audience, Jonathan Blake, now 68 years old, watched with quiet pride. His hair had turned completely grey, but his eyes shone with a satisfaction that money had never given him. He had chosen not to sit in the VIP section, preferring to be among the educators, social workers, and former street children who had made the moment they were witnessing possible. Human intelligence is like seeds, Matthew began in his acceptance speech. It's generously distributed throughout the earth, but only flourishes when it finds the right soil, water, and sunlight. His voice had matured, but maintained the clarity and honesty that had characterized him since childhood. During my first 10 years, I lived on the streets because the system had decided that children like me had no value. Today, I'm here because one person decided to look beyond appearances and see the potential others had ignored. The cameras briefly focused on Jonathan, who discreetly wiped away a tear. But this prize isn't just mine. It belongs to every child who has been underestimated, to every talent that has been wasted for lack of opportunities, and to every adult who has decided to invest in human potential instead of accumulating personal wealth. The applause was deafening, but Matthew raised his hand to continue. Today, I announce the next phase of our work. The Matthew Carter Foundation will establish the Global University of Exceptional Talents, where children from around the world can develop their unique abilities regardless of their origin or economic situation. The proposal caused a murmur of excitement in the audience. It was an ambitious project that would require massive resources and international coordination. But more important than any institution, Matthew continued, is the message I want to leave today. Every child who goes hungry on the street, every teenager who sleeps in shelters, every young person who has been labeled as hopeless could be the next to solve the problems we haven't been able to solve. He paused, his gaze finding Jonathan in the crowd. My biological father abandoned me unknowingly, but my real dad chose me consciously, and that choice changed not only our lives, but the lives of thousands of children around the world. After the ceremony, while journalists photographed and interviewed, Matthew approached Jonathan. "How does it feel to be the dad of a Nobel Prize winner?" he asked, with the mischievous smile he had never lost. "It feels like being Matthew's dad," Jonathan replied, hugging his son. "The prize is just a bonus." That night, during the celebration dinner, Matthew shared news that surprised even Jonathan. "I've decided to take a sabbatical year from mathematical research," he announced. "I want to return to the streets." "What do you mean?" asked Jonathan, confused. I want to spend a year living among street children in different cities, not as an academic visitor, but really living with them. I want to understand how the experience of urban survival develops specific types of intelligence that we're not capturing in our programs. It was a risky proposal that worried Jonathan, but he also recognized in it the same brave curiosity that had led Matthew to solve the mathematical riddle all those years ago. Isn't it dangerous? Everything valuable is a little dangerous, Matthew replied. Besides, I already know how to survive on the streets. Now I want to learn how to thrive on them. The project, which Matthew called Immersion in Hidden Genius, became one of the decade's most important sociological studies. For 12 months, he lived with street children in São Paulo, Mumbai, Mexico City, Manila, and Cairo. His findings revolutionized scientific understanding of how extreme adversity can catalyze unique forms of creativity and intelligence. He documented survival methods that required complex mathematical calculations, communication systems that rivaled military codes, and cooperation strategies that demonstrated advanced psychological sophistication. More importantly, he identified 237 children with exceptional capabilities who would have gone completely unnoticed by traditional talent detection methods. Upon his return, Matthew had developed a completely new protocol for identifying and nurturing genius in marginalized populations. His work became the global standard for humanitarian and educational organizations. But for Jonathan, the most impressive thing wasn't his son's academic achievements. It was seeing how Matthew had kept intact the humility, compassion, and emotional connection that had characterized him since childhood. Worldwide success hadn't corrupted his heart. On the 15th anniversary of the Challenge of the Century, the Foundation organized a global celebration where they brought together hundreds of children who had been supported over the years. Many of them were now successful adults who directed their own initiatives to help the next generation. During the event, an 8-year-old girl approached Matthew with a mathematical question she had developed while living in a refugee camp. Her problem was so complex and original that Matthew needed 3 hours to solve it. "How did you come up with this?" he asked, amazed by the sophistication of the girl's thinking. "I was hungry and cold, so I started thinking about numbers so I wouldn't feel the bad things," she replied with the direct honesty that Matthew immediately recognized. It was exactly the same survival strategy he had used 15 years earlier. That night, while reflecting on the complete cycle they had lived through, Matthew told Jonathan, "Do you know what's the most beautiful thing about all this?" "What?" "That every child we help becomes someone who can help others. The cycle never ends. It only expands." Jonathan nodded, understanding that they had created something bigger than a foundation or an educational program. They had initiated a global movement of recognition and development of human potential. 15 years after that day, when a street child solved an impossible riddle, the world had learned that true genius doesn't reside in ivory towers or exclusive institutions. It flourishes in the streets, in shelters, in the most unexpected places, waiting to be discovered by someone with the wisdom to look beyond appearances and see the infinite potential that resides in every human being. And the boy who once sold cookies to survive had become the man who taught the world that everyone deserves the opportunity to shine. 20 years later, on a sunny spring morning, Jonathan Blake, now 73 years old, walked slowly through the same park where Matthew had slept so many nights as a child. His steps were no longer as firm as before, but his purpose remained unshakable. He stopped in front of a statue the city had erected 5 years earlier, the bronze figure of a small boy solving mathematical equations on the ground with a box of cookies at his side. The plaque said simply, "To all the invisible geniuses waiting to be discovered. Good morning, son." Jonathan murmured, as he did every morning since his health had prevented him from traveling with Matthew around the world. That day was special. It was the 20th anniversary of the Challenge of the Century, and the Matthew Carter Foundation had organized the most ambitious event in its history. A global gathering where 1,000 exceptional children from 100 different countries would meet to present solutions to the most complex problems facing humanity. But more significant than the event itself was what had happened that morning. Matthew, now 32 years old and father to 2 adopted children he had found on the streets of different continents, had received a call that would once again change the course of his mission. The United Nations Council had unanimously approved the Matthew Carter Resolution, which established universal access to exceptional talent detection and development programs as a fundamental human right. It was the first time in history that intellectual potential had been officially recognized as a basic right of every child on the planet. When Matthew told Jonathan the news by phone, both cried. Not from sadness, but from the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that a life dedicated to service had managed to change not only individual lives, but the very structure of how humanity valued its most vulnerable members. "Do you know what this means, Dad?" Matthew had told him. "It means no child will ever be ignored because of their situation again. Every country in the world will have to actively search for their hidden geniuses." That afternoon, during the 20th anniversary celebration, something magical happened. The 1,000 children present not only presented their individual projects. Spontaneously, they began collaborating with each other, forming international teams that combined different types of genius to attack problems that no adult had managed to solve. A girl from Nigeria who had developed revolutionary water purification methods joined with a boy from Bangladesh, specializing in quantum mathematics, and a teenager from Bolivia, expert in sustainable agriculture. Together, in less than 6 hours, they designed a complete system that could provide clean water and nutritious food to any community in the world using only local resources. Other groups developed solutions for clean energy, universal education, communication between different cultures, and even methods for detecting and preventing social conflicts before they escalated to violence. Matthew watched from the stage, marveled by what he was witnessing. These children, many of whom had been rescued from situations of total abandonment, were now solving problems that had confused generations of adult experts. "This is what you always knew could happen, right?" asked Jonathan, who had arrived at the event in a wheelchair, but with eyes shining with pride. "No," Matthew replied honestly. "Not even in my most ambitious dreams did I imagine we would get this far. I thought we were going to help some children. I didn't think we were going to change the way the world understands human potential." At the end of the event, when the cameras had already left and most guests had returned to their countries, Matthew and Jonathan remained alone in the empty auditorium. It was the same auditorium where everything had begun 20 years earlier. "Do you regret anything?" asked Matthew, echoing the conversation they had had so many years before. "Only one thing," Jonathan replied with a smile, "and that I won't have 100 more years to see how far all this goes." 3 months later, Jonathan Blake died peacefully in his sleep. His last words, whispered to Matthew while holding his hand, were, "Thank you for teaching me that true wealth is measured in lives changed." At his funeral, there were no long speeches or pompous ceremonies. Instead, 1,000 children from around the world, all beneficiaries of the foundation, gathered to solve together the most complex mathematical problem they could create. It was their way of honoring the man who had learned that helping others shine was the only real measure of success. Matthew, now world director of the largest exceptional talent development network in human history, continued the work with the same humility he had shown as a child. But every morning, Before beginning his day, he visited Jonathan's grave and told him about the new geniuses they had discovered. "We found a girl in Somalia who can calculate climate patterns with precision that surpasses our most advanced computers," he would tell the simple marble headstone, "and a boy in Alaska who has developed food preservation methods that could eliminate world hunger." And each time he ended the conversation with the same words: "Thank you for seeing me when nobody else did. Thank you for teaching me that true love is the kind that decides to stay and help grow." Because in the end, that had been the most important lesson an arrogant businessman had learned from a street child: that miracles don't appear from nothing. They are created when someone decides to look with love where others see only problems, and when that love becomes constant action, day after day, year after year. Jonathan and Matthew's story had become legend, but their true legacy wasn't in history books. It was alive in every child who now had the opportunity to develop their genius, in every adult who had learned to see potential where they once saw obstacles, and in every community that had discovered that their own discarded could be their greatest treasures. And somewhere in the world, at this very moment, another extraordinary child is waiting to be discovered. Waiting for someone to have the wisdom to see beyond appearances and recognize that true human intelligence knows no borders, respects no social class, and isn't limited by external circumstances. It only needs to be seen, valued, and loved until it can flourish. If you've made it this far, it's because this story has touched something deep in your soul. And maybe, like Jonathan 20 years ago, you're wondering if you really know the extraordinary people who go unnoticed in your own life. How many times have you seen a street child and kept walking without wondering what hidden talent might be waiting to be discovered? How many times have you judged someone by their appearance, their economic situation, or their circumstances, without giving yourself the opportunity to know the brilliance that might be hidden behind that first impression? The truth is that we all have the power to be like Jonathan after his transformation. We can all choose to see potential where others see problems. We can all decide that our life will be measured not by what we accumulate, but by the lives we touch and elevate. Maybe you don't have millions of dollars to create an international foundation, but you have something even more powerful: the ability to see, value, and believe in someone who needs someone to believe in them. It could be the shy child in your neighborhood that everyone considers weird, but who might have a unique way of understanding the world. It could be the cleaning employee in your office whom you've never greeted, but who might have revolutionary ideas waiting to be heard. It could even be someone in your own family whose potential you've taken for granted. Right now, as you read these words, there are millions of Matthews in the world waiting for their transformed Jonathan. You brilliant children sleeping on the streets, genius teenagers working jobs that don't reflect their capabilities, extraordinary adults who never had the opportunity to develop their unique talents. But there are also millions of people like you who now know that miracles aren't supernatural events. They are the result of ordinary human beings making extraordinary decisions. The decision to see beyond, to believe in hidden potential, to invest time, energy, and love in helping others discover how extraordinary they can be. This story doesn't end when you close this video. It ends when you decide what you're going to do with what you've felt. It ends when you choose whether you're going to be part of the problem of indifference or part of the solution of active love. If this story changed something in your heart, don't keep it to yourself alone. Share it with someone who needs to remember that we all have value. Tell us in the comments what country you're watching from, and more importantly, tell us if you know someone extraordinary that the world hasn't discovered yet. Like this video, if you believe we all deserve the opportunity to shine. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing stories that remind us that humanity is capable of extraordinary things when we choose love over indifference. And remember, somewhere near you, there's a genius waiting to be discovered. The question isn't whether they exist. The question is whether you'll be the one who has the wisdom and courage to see them. Because in the end, as Jonathan Blake learned, it doesn't matter how much money you have in the bank. What matters is how much love you have in your heart, and how much of that love you're willing to convert into action to change someone else's life. The world is full of Matthews waiting. Will you be the next to transform?